The federal government is challenging Stellantis' decision to shift production of the Jeep Compass down south. Is it time for Canada to look beyond the big three automakers? Should we embrace China's ascendant auto industry instead? I asked Greg Mordu, Associate Professor in the W. Booth School of Engineering Practice and Technology at McMaster University and former General Manager at Toyota Motor Manufacturing Canada. Greg, welcome to the program. How are you doing today?
Good. Glad to be here.
I want to start with Ottawa and Stellantis. Ottawa is launching a dispute resolution process against Stellantis for moving a planned vehicle production from Brampton to the U.S. Does this have any teeth? Does this move anything substantial to hold them accountable?
Well, every one of those agreements are different, and I'm sure that Stellantis signed agreements for their work in Windsor and their extension of what we're talking specifically about in Brampton, as well as their joint venture with LG to build batteries in Windsor. So all of those will be different. They may have some connections between the two of them. I don't know the details of that. They haven't shared them. It's considered proprietary, but I've looked at those in the past, and they typically are they are funded in such a way that if there's an agreement, you're going to bring this technology, you're going to build this product, and if you meet your requirements and you spend the money, the government of Canada and the province of Ontario will send the funds in kind. And if you don't do that, you'll have some kind of a discussion about what to do going forward, or if plans change, and plans do change as they go through. The issue is, at this point, from what I understand, insofar as the Brampton is concerned, is that they funded $110 million. Sounds like a lot. It's more than walking around change. But frankly, if Stellantis comes through this and someone says, for you to get out of Brampton, it's going to cost you $110 million, I think they'll probably say we're out of there. So you got to be careful what you ask for. Having said that, I don't think it's a terrible thing, frankly, for the government of Canada to put pressure on Stellantis. I mean, the first and perhaps most satisfying aspect of that is it holds their feet to the fire. But by holding their feet to the fire, frankly, it may cause them to say, listen, we don't have anything for Brampton, admit that they don't have anything for
Right.
Brampton. And frankly, they'll be doing those employees, their existing employees that are hanging on with those $45 an hour jobs, or the promise or the hope of those $45 an hour jobs. They'll be able to cut their ties and frankly get on with their lives. And the sooner they can do that, it'll be tough. It's difficult for everyone. Frankly, it's easy for me to sit here and make that pronouncement, but it allows them to go forward, because nobody in Brampton wants to hire anybody that makes $45 an hour, because they know, understandably, that they're gone the very next day when they get called back. So it's a tough pill, but but perhaps it's a positive attribute of what the industry minister has added to the conversation.
Well, speaking of tough pills to swallow, is there a conversation right now that we should be having about how much faith Canadians should have in the big three U.S. automakers right now?
Well, it's common to say that in the year 2000, or 1999, which was the high watermark for the Canadian auto industry, we made 3 million vehicles in this country. The vast majority of those were made by the D3. Last year, we made 1.3 million vehicles in Canada. The big manufacturers were Toyota at number one, and number two was Honda. They're responsible, excuse me, for about three-quarters of the production in this country. So we've had a steady diet of promises and pronouncements by the D3, and corresponding with that is a steady decline in their production. Frankly, uh, Stellantis is still hanging in there in Windsor. That's basically their manufacturing footprint, and that's the largest D3 manufacturing outlet in Canada, but General Motors has gone from well over a million, including a million in production in Oshawa in the early parts of this century, to a rump of about 100,000 today. They used to be the largest automaker in Canada. Now they're the fourth largest. Frankly, they'd be the fifth largest. In other words, the smallest if it weren't for the fact that Ford isn't making anything right now.
I want us to stay on this page. I'm hoping you can give us a bit of a history lesson here. This isn't the first time that Canada's auto industry has faced challenges. Take us back to the 50s and 60s and how we've sort of come through that and what we can learn from there.
So there are a lot of good lessons to be learned from the industrial policy measures that the governments of Canada, primarily alongside the government of Ontario, have taken us. Back in the late 50s, early 60s, the industry was starting to suffer. We had 17.5, I believe, percent tariffs on vehicles coming in from the US, which essentially made for an environment where if you wanted to sell a car in Canada, you had to make that car in Canada. So Canadians were understandably a little flummoxed because they were paying more for essentially the same vehicles. Because when you can't achieve economies of scale, you can't offer products at a competitive price. Meanwhile, we had the devaluation of currencies in Europe at that time, and we had a influx of European vehicles, and then the economy was suffering, and so all that meant was that that employment started to crater in the Canadian auto industry. So there was pressure placed upon the industry. So what Canada did was what Canada does is set up a royal commission and kick it down the road a little bit. And Vincent Bladen, I'm going to tell you lots of stories. Vincent Bladen was appointed the royal commissioner, and he heard lots of interesting things, including a presentation from the United Auto Workers of Canada that we should have a Canadian-owned automobile company, which will probably resonate in local times, current times as well. But ultimately, out of all of that came something called the Auto Pact in 1965, and the way it was implemented is you needed to make a vehicle in Canada for everyone you sold. Didn't need to be the vehicle, but if you were a company selling 100,000 vehicles a year in Canada, you had to commit to make 100,000 vehicles a year in Canada, and to make sure that you weren't just bringing in vehicles from the U.S., for example, and putting some hubcaps on them, for example, and saying, "There, we made it here." We had a 60% Canadian value added for the vehicles.
You mentioned, I want to pick up on the Auto Pact. You mentioned the Auto Pact, but and you mentioned the people behind it. To what extent do the personalities behind these negotiations make the difference of a good deal?
Well, that's the Auto Pact, and there are personalities associated with that as well. But if you really want to talk about personalities, you come to the next crisis point for the Canadian auto industry, which is the late 70s, early 1980s. We had the OPEC oil crises of 1973, 1979. Gas prices went way up. North Americans wanted cheaper cars. North American automakers didn't make good quality small cars at that point in time. So the Japanese entered the market and caused all kinds of upheaval by the then what we called to the big three, and this notion of if you sell here, you must build here. And we still hear that today. And in the aftermath of Brampton's issues and challenges. So the personality at the time was Ed Lumley, and he was the trade and industry minister. He passed away earlier this year, but he, frankly, for auto industrial policy researchers such as myself, Ed Lumley becomes a bit of a hero. And frankly, there would be no auto industry in Canada today if it weren't for the personality and forcefulness of Ed Lumley, because he took that build here, sell here, build here mantra and he took it to Japan, and he was very forceful, and he used the steady diet of sticks. If you don't build here, we're going to tariff the heck out of you. We're going to require content provisions. We're going to inspect every car in the port of Vancouver to make sure that they're safe, and back up the port, and make it difficult for you. These were the threats, but he said also, but if you come here, you're going to be welcomed, and we're going to make it positive for you, and we're going to use this tool called duty remission, to make it more advantageous for you to be here. In other words, we're going to remit those duties you pay, or some of those duties you pay on your incoming vehicles, if you commit to build vehicles here or purchase parts here or some combination of the above. So they established all of these interesting policy tools to encourage Japanese production. So from that, we had Suzuki, which came in to alongside General Motors for the Kami plant in Ingersoll, which is under discussion right now, and Toyota came into Cambridge, and Honda went to Alliston, and they were very small plants, 50,000 for Toyota, 40,000 for Alliston, when a full scale assembly plant is about 250,000, but they grew, and now Toyota makes about 500,000 vehicles a year in Cambridge and Woodstock, and Honda makes about 400,000, give or take, every year in Alliston, which comes back to the point that personalities are important.
Greg, I want to have a conversation of, in our last minute, where do we need to go now? Your research has shown, in your research, you have probably seen that China looks like a very attractive partner for Canada in the auto industry. Tell us why why we should be looking in that direction.
Well, if you look at it purely from the perspective of automotive industrial policy, there's no question China is the avenue we should pursue. And there will be all kinds of people that disagree with me about that. And we need to have that debate. I understand that China is difficult for lots of other reasons as well. And we don't need to, and I won't get into those. But China, if we follow the lessons that you and I have gone through, between attaching ourselves to the strongest or ascendant automakers, first in the 60s with the US, second in the 80s with Japan, and now clearly the ascendant automaker, particularly as we move into the electrification of mobility. We're not moving as quickly in North America as the rest of the world, but if we move in that direction, China is clearly the leader. My own research, for example, shows that China generates automotive patents and have for the past decade at a rate of about 5-1 over the US. So you can get away with not innovating to the same degree as your competitors for a while, and be okay. But over the long term, there's nothing about the US auto industry that suggests that it is going to be a global leader going forward. And there's nothing about the US industrial policy measures or the energy policy measures that suggest that continuing to try to tether our industry to the US industry is the best bet. So I know China is challenging for lots of different reasons, but if we're looking at it pure from where do we want to be so do we want an auto industry in Canada, we need to have that conversation.
Greg, we are going to leave it there. Really appreciate your insights, and we appreciate the history lesson as well.
Thank you.